Hello and welcome to Why Hope. This is Series 1, Episode 1. In this series, we're looking at the question of the God who acts in history. And in this episode, I want us to focus on the idea of the God who knows the end from the beginning. This isn't a bad place to begin a new year. Let me read you some words from Isaiah 46. I'm going to read you just 3 verses, but I do encourage you to turn to the whole chapter. It's an absolutely marvellous chapter. Let me read you these words from verse 8. Remember this and consider. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention. Now, what's the context for this? The prophet is speaking to a people who are in exile, a people who've been taken far from their home against their will, who've seen great catastrophe, who've experienced enormous dislocation. And not just dislocation, but a real sense of abandonment by God. Many of them will have experienced enormous trauma. And into that situation, the prophet brings a word of hope from God. And part of the hope, or the foundation of this hope, if you like, is this: I am God and there is no other. And I declare the end from the beginning. The Bible has a great sweep of a story. It begins back before the beginning of history, and it ends after the end of history, and it in some way encompasses the whole of human history, which of course we are still sitting within. And to begin the year by orientating ourselves to the God who knows the end from the beginning is no bad thing. The God who is not surprised by any of the twists and turns of history, and the God who is working through them all. I declare the end from the beginning, he says, and I say my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention. Now, in episodes to come, we will look at some of the details of how God acts in history. And in particular, or one of the things we'll be looking at, is the way that he acts towards those who set themselves in opposition, who choose to act cruelly and heartlessly towards others who are made in God's image. We won't go into the details of that today, but let's hold on to this big idea of the God who knows the end from the beginning, the God who is surprised by nothing, and who says, my purposes shall stand, I will fulfill my intention. Just to enrich this a little bit more, I want to read a couple more passages, one from Isaiah and one from a psalm. So turning back in our Bibles a little bit to Isaiah 40, part of this same passage where the prophet is bringing God's comfort to his traumatized and dislocated people, we read these words. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in. So the prophet has this extraordinary vision of the transcendence of God, sitting. Think about those images you've probably seen in some of the classical art, with God sitting high and enthroned and the earth spread out before him. Now, that image can give us hope, but also could give us anxiety, and maybe could even make us wonder if the God who is enthroned above the circle of the earth could possibly connect with little you and me, who are like grasshoppers, as the prophet says. But listen how the prophet goes on. This is the God who, verse 23, brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. This is a God who doesn't just sit above the circle and the earth and allow it to get on with its own thing. God could have wound up the earth like that watchmaker that people talk about sometimes and walked away. and left it just to run down. But he doesn't. He remains intimately involved, transcendent over it, and yet attentive to the people who were just like grasshoppers. God could have wound it up and walked away, or he could have begun with the intention of remaining intimately involved, and then when we just allowed our own wickedness and folly to pile up, he might have then washed his hands and said, well, do you know what, just I'll leave you to your own devices. But he doesn't. He is at once transcendent, sitting above the circle of the earth, and attentive to the individuals upon it. One more passage to look at, which is from Psalm 90, another wonderful, wonderful text that you might like to have a look at this week and meditate on it. And in Psalm 90, the psalmist is reflecting on the brevity of human life and God's eternity. He begins by saying, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. This is the great sweep of history and beyond history. And then he speaks about the brevity of human life, and he says, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or just like a watch in the night. We humans, we come and we go. He compares us elsewhere in the psalm to the grass, which flowers one day and is dead the next. But 1,000 years is just a moment in God's sight, because he is God from everlasting to everlasting. So in Isaiah 40, we have this image of God who is transcendent above the earth, and in Psalm 90, we have this image of a God who is eternal, who is from before all things and after all things. And again, this could give us hope, because this is a God who is worth putting our trust in, and yet it might make us think, well, how can our coming and going, our brief moment of life, how can that make even a blip on God's radar? But listen, the psalmist is confident that it absolutely makes a blip on God's radar, because listen, he prays this at the end of the psalm. Turn, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. The psalmist declares God's eternity, and yet is bold enough and confident enough in God's attention and interest in the individual to make this specific claim, this specific prayer. This is something to hold on to. This is a God who is indeed transcendent, but a God who pays attention to each individual. The God who knows the end from the beginning and who acts in history to bring about his purpose. Just remind you of two more places that you might like to have a look this week and have a meditate. In Genesis 50, it's near the end of the Joseph story. And you'll remember the Joseph story, I suspect, is the story of a young man who was appallingly treated by his brothers, sold into slavery and abandoned for many years. And at the end of that story, there's this reconciliation with his brothers. And they're fearful. They're fearful he's going to exact revenge upon them. And he says these words to them in verse 20 of Genesis 50. He says, God intended it for good. And it's a very interesting thing to reflect upon. Joseph isn't saying, God made this happen. God did this to me. He knows his brothers did this, and his brothers alone bear the culpability for it. But God is bending it towards good. God is using it for good. God is active in history, bending the arc of history towards justice and love and peace. Sometimes we are impatient with the pace of that, and that's okay. So is the psalmist, so is the prophet, so are the apostles. But God is active in history. And if you remember those words from Joseph, you will probably remember the way that the Apostle Paul picks up those words in that marvellous chapter, Romans 8. And in verse 28 he says this, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. I don't want us to make this small. I don't want us to say, oh, that car crash was God working for good. I think this is bigger than that. This is God bending this arc of history. This is God doing something far bigger than our tiny minds can understand. But he is working in history. He is bending it towards good. He knows the end from the beginning, and he is a God who is good enough and big enough and powerful enough to put our trust into. And that is why we can hope. I'll see you next time.